Well, it is good to see each of you in the class this evening. As Johnny said, it's been a very beautiful day, a nice spring day. If you were able to get out, you surely enjoyed the outside a little bit. It's supposed to be even better tomorrow. And so we're glad that you're able to be with us here in our Bible study time tonight. We're going to be looking at the Song of Solomon tonight. As we continue to look at each of the books of the Bible as they relate to matters of redemption and the redeemed, and as far as the book of Solomon, Song of Solomon is concerned, I believe what we have in this book is the kind of marriage the redeemed will have. Some of you maybe remember, I've mentioned this before, Proverbs 31, and you're familiar with that, talks about the worthy woman, all of the various characteristics that worthy woman possesses. But then in the book of Job, chapter 31 of that book, and it's interesting that it's 31, you have characteristics that Job describes of himself, and basically says to those who would challenge his integrity, those who would challenge his faithfulness to God, you consider all of these things about me. And he lists a number of characteristics in that regard. And I've often mentioned that if you put the man of Job 31 with the woman of Proverbs 31 in a marriage relationship, what a wonderful relationship it would have to be. What a fine Christian home that would be. But it's not impossible to be the kind of man that is described in Job 31, nor is it impossible to be the kind of woman that is described in Proverbs 31. Certainly each of these chapters give us, both the men and the women, something about which we need to think in our relationship one with the other. The home is a very unique institution, ordained, established, set in motion by God. The rules and regulations governing that home were given by God, and when they are followed and respected, it presents a very beautiful picture of the home. I think that's what we have basically in the book Song of Solomon, and as we develop this study tonight, I hope you'll be impressed with some of the aspects of this book that we'll mention to you. By way of introduction, we mentioned in the first part that it is, according to the Jews, the Holy of Holies of Scripture. It's amazing to me that you can find a few, but very few, critics who will suggest that the book Song of Solomon should not have been included in the Scriptures. And yet the Jews had the highest regard for the Song of Solomon. And it certainly is deserving of that, because if you'll notice in chapter 1 in verse 1, he begins by saying the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Literally, that phrase, Song of Songs, is the best of the songs. Now we mentioned in the outline in 1 Kings chapter 4 and in verse 32, the writer there says that Solomon wrote 1,005 songs. That's a lot of songs. And yet this one is described as the best of the songs, the song of the songs. And so it is giving the highest praise to this particular song that Solomon wrote in that regard. Some have tried to take the book, Song of Solomon, and press some allegorical interpretations of the book, and we've listed those. Some have said that this is really nothing but a book that expresses God's love for Israel. No one can question God's love for Israel. That love of God is manifest in so many ways, on so many different occasions. from His bringing them out of Egyptian bondage, as recorded in the book of Exodus, under the leadership of Moses, to the crossing of the Red Sea, crossing of the Jordan River, God's presence with them in their taking captive the land of Canaan, His preservation of them through difficult times, times when they were unfaithful to God and began to serve the gods of the nations in whose land they dwelt. God still manifests His continued love for them in sending the judges or deliverers to get them out from under the various oppressions that characterize the time period that we refer to as the Judges. And all through their history, God's love is seen for them over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, when you begin reading the book of Deuteronomy, one of the things that Moses says to that second generation of Israel, don't make the same mistake that your fathers made. And one of the first things that he mentions is that your father said, God does not love us. How could you have been a part of that first generation and reached that conclusion? Nevertheless, they did. They said, God doesn't love us. He brought us out here in the wilderness to die, brought us to the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army, where there were not enough graves in Egypt. And so time after time after time, they ignored or soon forgot what God had done for them and focused on the difficulties in which they found themselves. And we do that today, don't we? We can become so bombarded with difficulties in this life that we forget all of the good things of life that God has done for us. That's what they did. And so to that second generation, Moses would say, don't make that mistake. Don't accuse God of not loving you. And so God manifests His love over and over. But there's absolutely no indication that I can find in the book Song of Solomon that suggests that that is the point of the book. Others have suggested that the book Song of Solomon was written in some form of a prophetic setting to suggest Christ's love for the church. Again, nobody that accepts the Bible anyway is going to question Christ's love for the church. What is the church? People. People. What kind of people? People who were in times past alienated from God, doing everything that their mind and the flesh said do, and yet because of God's love, He provided His only begotten Son and His death on the cross, that through the shedding of His blood, people could be redeemed from that way of transgression. Ephesians chapter 2 is an excellent example of that. You who were dead in trespasses and sins, who were by nature the children of wrath, God in His mercy has made you alive. So when you look at all of that God has done for the church, and then Christ gave His life for the church. As a matter of fact, in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul said, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. So we should never question the love that Christ has for the church. But again, there is no indication that I can see, at least, in the book Song of Solomon that suggests it is prophetic with regard to the love of Christ for the church. What the song appears to be is the beauty and the holiness of married love. And we'll see some of that as we study through the book. Solomon had married a Shulamite. Some references have it Shulamite, some have it Shunammite. It's the same context. A woman of Israel, and again some have tried to suggest that because of the statement that she makes in verse 5 of chapter 1, that in all probability this was Pharaoh's sister that he married. But again, there's no indication of that. There's reference to the Shunammite in the book itself, and then some of the references that can be mentioned in the book would suggest the same. But a woman that obviously loved him, and a woman that he obviously loved. And it speaks of that love throughout the book. The central message then, I would suggest, from this book is the divine gift of married love. Marriage started where? The very beginning of time. The creation of the first two, Adam and Eve. They were brought together, the woman being made from the rib of the man, and brought for them to be together. And then, of course, Matthew's statements in Matthew 19, what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And there are certain things in that regard that could be mentioned further. But to tie it into this concept of redemption, redemption affects how we act and react in the home, does it not? If we are God's redeemed people, by virtue of our obedience to that portion of the gospel of Christ, then it would affect our obedience to the gospel in other areas of life, in this particular case, especially in the home and in the marriage relationship. In point 1, the structure of the book, and I noted in parentheses there, it varies from author to author. You can get different breakdowns of the book. This particular one I've just simply printed out for you, and you can look at it. But I wanted to give you another one, and I don't know if you can write these down or just ignore me till I get through with it or whatever you want to do. But I want to break it down in a little different way, primarily by chapters. And I think it'll be a little easier. There's a little bit of overlap here and there, but I think this makes the book a little bit more easily remembered. So if I were going to label chapter 1, I would label it the courtship. Now what I'm going to do a little bit later in the class, I want us to come back and I want to develop chapter 1 point by point and try to help you get started at least in a detailed study of the book of Song of Solomon. And I think if we get you started in chapter 1, then as you read through some of the rest of it, it might fall into place a little better for you in that regard. But the courtship. If I were going to label chapter 2, I would label it as a mutual expression of love. Mutual expression of love. Solomon speaks to her, she responds, he responds, conversation back and forth in that regard. So a mutual expression of love. Chapter 3, I would label as the bride seeking the groom in a relationship. And then the latter part of that chapter really kind of seems to indicate the wedding itself. But the chapter 3, for the most part, the bride seeking the groom in that regard. Chapter 4, a little bit more detailed here, because this chapter seemingly has several different sections to it. But the wedding feast, the honeymoon, the groom's praise, and the bride's response. Chapter 5, the marriage in difficulty. You would expect that, wouldn't you? That after there was a marriage that there'd eventually be difficulty. Marriage in difficulty. what you have in chapter 5 is that he is rejected at least for a time, and then she turns and seeks him again. So there's a little difficulty there. Chapter 6, mutual growing love. How many times have you heard it said that in marriage that two people ought to grow more and more and more in love with the passing of time? Unfortunately, in far too many marriages, we see them growing further and further and further apart. I want to stop right there. We'll get chapter 7 and 8. Actually, just go ahead and include chapter 7 with chapter 6 because it's kind of a continuation. Then in chapter 8, and I'm just going to give you that and be through with it. Chapter 8, true married love. Now, with those chapter headings, there ought to be something in this book that would be of interest and help to every one of us in our marriage relationships. If this is in fact a book that expresses the true love that God designed for man and a woman expressed through Solomon and this Shunammite woman, then certainly we can learn some lessons in that regard. I want to, at this point, and this is not in your outline, but I want to go back and look a little bit at chapter 1. And then we'll, if time permits, we'll look at point 2 that's in your outline, which deals with the treatment of human sexuality in the Bible. There's a lot about it in the Bible. It's something that we seem to shy away from discussing. But we are made the way we are made by God and placed in a relationship that God intended to be compatible, man with woman. Now, there may be some things that we should not or would not talk about in a mixed class. But we ought not to be afraid to discuss God's Word as God sets it forth. And sometimes I think we're ashamed of it. But it is very plain language in this book. But it helps us to understand what true married love is all about. You know, one of the problems in marriage today is that we allow the world to define what a good marriage is, rather than allowing God to define it. And in part of it may be because we have not studied the book, Song of Solomon. There's a lot in here. All right, let's go back now, and the time remaining, and I'm not going to have time to deal with all these points in detail, but I kind of want to outline and briefly discuss chapter 1 with you. And like I said, maybe that'll help get you started in the book itself. Chapter 1 we noted as the courtship. If I were going to break the chapter down into sections, I'd say verses 1 through the first part of verse 4 would be the choice of courtship. The choice of courtship. Here is a woman who praises the one that she seems to be falling in or has fallen in love with at this particular point. She praises the man that she loves. It's interesting in here that she even likes the fragrance that he wears. Apparently it's better than what I wore last Wednesday night. She even likes the sound of his name. You notice how she words that thy name is as ointment poured forth. She likes the sound of his name. And there are obviously other things that'll be noted in the book. You think about that for a moment and some applications of that. Why is it important to think about the choice of courtship? Who are you going to marry? You're going to marry people you date. You're going to marry somebody that you date. Usually. I don't know that I know of anybody that married somebody that they hadn't dated before. So this matter of courtship and the choice that is made in that regard. And probably our young people need this to some degree because there are a lot of immature, irresponsible choices that are made in courtship that lead to difficulties down the road. But if you want to look at a biblical example of that, and we're not going to take the time to go back and study it, but you can do this on your own. Judges chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. The case of Samson. He went down and he found a Temanite, if I remember correctly. He comes back home, and what does he say to his dad or his parents? Go get her. I want her. Why? Because she looks good. The problem is, in his choice, number one, he disregarded God's instruction with regard to marriage at that point. And that's basically the advice that his parents gave him, which he also disregarded. Is there not a woman in Israel? And so, out of that, then later, you'll recall in Judges chapter 16, he went into a harlot down in Gaza, as some pronounce it. Judges chapter 16 also, then there was Delilah. You remember the problem there? So here's a man who made some choices in courtship that ultimately led to marriages that were not good for him. Many young people make the same mistake. Need to recognize that marriage is not based upon physical beauty. It's not based upon status. It's not based upon an opportunity to escape an unhappy home life. It's not something that's to take place to avoid being single the rest of your life. But it is something to be done because there is love, biblical love, that exists, as set forth in this book. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, husbands, love your wives. To what degree? Christ loved the church, gave himself for it. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 describes that love. So you've got the courtship here. Then in the latter part of verse 4, in which we will be glad and rejoice in thee. We will remember thy love more than wine. The upright love thee. Latter part of verse 4 there. So it says, we will be glad and rejoice in thee. Seems that probably this was a statement made by the Shunammite woman's friends because of the love that she has expressed for Solomon. We'll rejoice with you. You notice in verse 5 she says, I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem. So they're probably the ones who are doing the speaking. In the latter part of verse 4, there's a celebration here of this courtship. She's found her a good man. Any of you parents have had kids on the prowl for a mate, and they bring one home that you really feel good about? What do? Well, you don't celebrate in front of them because reverse psychology will set in. Don't show it in front of them. Because just as surely as you like it, they won't. But you might celebrate on the side. Or you know how young people are when, here's a young lady or young man who's really trying to hook up, if you please, with one of the opposite sex. They want to date them so bad they think they want to marry them, and finally they get that first date with them. And what do all their friends do? All right. They celebrate with them because they've got what they want finally. Hopefully it's a good relationship. But that seems to be the case here in the latter part of verse 4, celebration. Then in verses 5 and 6, there is the concern of courtship. I am black, but comely. O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. She declares herself to be a bit inferior here, seems like. Not so pleased or concerned about her appearance. Maybe she felt unattractive. Maybe she felt undeserving of the love of a man like Solomon. Black as the tents of Kedar. You go back and do a little study on that. The tents of Kedar seems to be a reference to the tents that some of the nomadic tribes in that area used that were made out of black goat skin. So they probably wouldn't be the most attractive of materials of which a tent or anything else could be made. That's what she compares herself to. I would take that she's a little concerned if because of her physical unattractiveness is going to affect her courtship. But then you come down to verse 6 of that, and she defends herself. Consider my harsh background. Her mother's children were angry with her. Do you have siblings? They ever get angry with you? Try to get even with you? Try to put you in an uncomfortable position? I'm told, I don't remember it. Fortunately, I have no scars to prove it. But I'm told that my brother and sister set me up on top of a wood stove when I was real young to get me out of their hair. Apparently it wasn't on and I wasn't big enough to get down. But siblings have a way of getting at one another. That's what she says here. My mother's children are angry with me, so they made me work the vineyard. So the sun has affected her complexion, her skin in that regard. And I haven't had time to take care of my own. So she shows that concern in that regard. Does that sound like young people today? Or older people, for that matter, who are wanting to court? How much time do you spend in front of a mirror, worried about your complexion? How much you spend on this cream and this herb and that herb, trying to get this wrinkle out and that wrinkle out? I better not go any further on that one, had I? Ken's already drawing up. I can see him now. And I'll be drawn up when I get home, trust me. Oh, is that what it is? Okay. But you know, an interesting thing that seems to be the case, the darker colored nations love the lighter skins, and the lighter colored skin nations love darker skin. I guess that's where the tanning salons and booths or whatever they are got started at. If we were darker, if we had a better tan, we could attract somebody better. Is that what it's all about? Well, in Proverbs chapter 30, go back there just a minute. Proverbs 31, I'm sorry. Proverbs 31 and in verse 30. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain. So what does that say? Then you think of the statement made in 1 Peter chapter 3. First Peter chapter 3 and verse 4. Whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of the plaiting of the hair, wearing of gold, or putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. A little different than what we normally think of in that regard. Incidentally, back in Proverbs chapter 31, and in verse 22, she maketh herself coverings of tapestry, her clothing is silk and purple. Maybe there's not so much wrong with trying to be attractive. We're not suggesting that that's wrong in and of itself, but that should never be the basis of a marriage relationship or courtship. But what's wrong with maintaining that appearance once you get the person that you've been adorning yourself trying to get? What's wrong with continuing to look good for the one that you love? Just a thought. Then you've got verses 7 and 8. You've got the contentment of courtship. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest, where thou makest thy flock to rest at noon. For why should I be as one that turneth aside by the flocks of thy companions? What's she saying? Tell me where you're going to have your flocks. Why do you think she didn't want to know that? So she could go be with him. So she could be with him. The contentment in that regard. She was comfortable and relaxed when she was with Solomon. And so in verse 8, her friends again encourage her, if thou know not, O thou fairest among women, go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed thy kids beside the shepherd's tent. You go after him. Follow him. Find out where he is. Spend the time with him. But again, such contentment in courtship should continue in marriage. You recall in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, where Peter talks about the husband dwelling with his wife. Remember that little phrase, dwell? Literally there, that means dwell with. Togetherness, close companionship. Found this little statement that I think ties in well with that. There's far too much emphasis on making a career today more than making a marriage. Let that one soak in a little bit. And think about how many marriage problems you know that have come out of emphasis on career rather than emphasis on the marriage. Then in verse 9, and actually this goes on into chapter 2 and verse 2, but I have to make this brief. There's the communication of courtship. Now you talk about a problem. There it is. The communication. Not necessarily in courtship, but after the courtship has ended in marriage. That's the lack of communication is a major problem. But I want you to notice three concepts rather hurriedly here about their communication, and then I'm going to go back and I'll develop these as he gives me time to do it. Their words were plentiful. You read through here and they were just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, talking to one another. Their words were personal. You notice in her conversation toward him, she uses the phrase, my beloved. When he's speaking to her, he refers to my love. Makes it pretty personal, don't you? You got a pet name for your mate? Pet names can say a lot if used properly. Hey you is probably not a pet name. They're plentiful, they're personal, and they're positive. Verse 9, I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses and Pharaoh's chariots. Now, guys, don't go home and tell your wife she looks like a horse. Probably going to get you in trouble, okay? But look at what he says. The horses of Pharaoh's chariots. What kind of horses did Pharaoh have? The best, the most beautiful available on the face of this earth. That would be a compliment in that regard. So you have to be careful about how you use that kind of language. See, she's expressed concern about her appearance. Is this going to affect our courtship? He says, you make me think of the horses, Pharaoh's chariots. Positive language in that regard. Then she reciprocates, he responds, she responds. It's interesting how you carry that through in that regard. He compliments her cheeks, he compliments her neck, he compliments her hair. He's so complimentary. Guys, wake up! How long has it been since you complimented your wife about anything? Might affect the love relationship in your marriage. Is that the second bell? All right, that's the first one. All right, good. About this matter of communication, I ran across these little interesting stories today about a couple who had their 50th wedding anniversary celebration. After all the guests had left, they went home. Just before bedtime, they decided they'd have a snack before they went to bed. So they go. He opens up a new loaf of bread. And he takes out the end piece. Do y'all call that the heel here in Georgia? Okay. Took out the heel. And he gave it to his wife. And she exploded. She said, you have been doing me that way for 50 years. And I'm not going to take it one day more. And she just went on and on and on. She got through. He said, I'm sorry. But he said, that's my favorite piece of bread. And I was saving it for you. The piece that he loved the most, she hated the most. Communication would have solved that problem, wouldn't it? 50 years ago it would have solved that. They had a long relationship, but apparently it wasn't as good. So communication has a major emphasis. This one is a little more on the humorous side, I thought. The lady goes to a lawyer. She says, I want a divorce. He says, do you have grounds? She said, yeah, we've got a little over an acre. That kind of frustrated him a little bit. He said, well, do you have a grudge? She said, no, but we've got a beautiful carport. Well, he really doesn't know much to say now, except he says, well, does he beat you up? She says, nope. I get up every day before he does. So now he's totally frustrated. He says, well, just why is it that you want this divorce? And he said, I've been married 16 years to a man who can't even carry on an intelligent conversation. Okay, it's soaking in. It's soaking in. All right. Now you take the book and go from there with the headings that I gave you. And look at the mutual love that is expressed. Look at the language that's used. Look at some of the figurative expressions that are made within that book. You'll begin to see the kind of love and the action and reaction that ought to be taking place in our homes. So we're going to stop right there. You can study through this other material. I gave you an abundance of scriptures for you to look at in that regard, the matter of human sexuality in the Bible, and there's certainly some things there that affects a lot of marriages. You better take it seriously. All right.